A sample board is the best way to create an expectation of what your project is really going to look like. Sample boards can provide accurate representations of joint spacing, grout color. They can even show how sealers are going to affect your terracotta tile. And they're also really easy and fun to make. For this sample board, we're going to be testing Clay Imports' antique matte terracotta in 4" by 4". We're going to be sealing it with Miracle Sealants 511 Sealant Enhance, grouting it with Mapei's UltraColor Plus FA in color Sandstorm. And we're going to be installing this board on a piece of foam Kerdi-Board. The first step in creating the best sample board possible is to use full pieces of tile, no cuts, and to incorporate the actual grout joint spacing that you're planning to use on your project. For this particular project, we're using a 1/4 inch grout joint, and I've got 9 pieces of tile that measure approximately 4 1/8 inch by 4 1/8 inch. Take an exact measurement of your tile layout and then mark the subboard or the substrate that you're going to be using to install the sample board on. In this case, we're using a foam board called Kerdi-Board. However, wood or hardyback are also common options. I prefer the foam board because it's really lightweight, significantly lighter than plywood or hardybacker, and it's really easy to cut. I can just slice it with a utility blade. Once your substrate is cut to size, lay the tiles on the board again before you start adhering them, just to make sure that it's cut to the correct dimensions. Next, you've got to decide what type of adhesive you're going to use to stick the tiles onto the board. I've decided to use white Thinset. This is a Versabond grade Thinset for this project, and I chose this product for 2 reasons. Number one, it dries slightly flexible. It's not going to be as brittle as some other cement adhesive products, and secondly, it's a slow drying Thinset, so it'll allow me more time to move the tiles around and correct grout joint spacings as I'm installing. But additionally, slow drying Thinsets are also generally recommended for terracotta tiles and other porous materials. In all cases, including a sample board, you want to make sure that there are no clumps or unmixed chunks of Thinset in your Thinset mixture. Wetting the board can also help with slowing the drying process of the Thinset. This does make a little bit of a difference with the Kerdi-Board, but it makes a significant difference. It'll help slow the drying significantly if you're using hardyback or plywood. Next, apply the Thinset to the board. As far as the adhesive coverage for sample boards, you're going to need approximately 1½ cups of Thinset adhesive per square foot of sample board. This sample board is just a little larger than 12 inches by 12 inches, and it's going to use almost 2 cups of mixed Thinset. This is mixed Thinset. This is not the powder form Thinset. And that's mixed Thinset, approximately 2 cups. And the reason I'm using a little more than usual is the trowel. The trowel that I'm using to trowel this Thinset onto the sample board. This is a big 3/4 inch trowel, meaning that the ridges of the Thinset are going to be 3/4 inch wide by 3/4 inch tall, each one of those ridges. And that's going to consume more Thinset than if I was using a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch trowel, for example. For irregular tiles, such as handmade terracottas, the smallest trowel that I would recommend is 5/8 inch, or ideally a 3/4 inch trowel. Applying some moisture to the back of terracotta tiles is another way of slowing the drying process of the Thinset. And again, the reasons that we want to slow the drying process are not only to have more time to adjust the tiles as we're installing them, but also to ensure a greater bond between the Thinset adhesive and the terracotta. If the Thinset adhesive dries too fast, then it will not grab onto or adhere to the back of the terracotta tile properly. We need slow drying, allowing the Thinset time to actually absorb into the body of the terracotta tile. Since we've already laid these tiles out with the actual grout joint spacing that we're planning to use and took measurements off of that to cut our sample board, installation is going to be really fast and easy. All we need to do is start laying the tiles along the bottom row, lining up the edges of the tile with the edges of the foam board. When initially placing the tiles onto the bed of Thinset adhesive, just lay the tiles gently onto the mortar, with only the weight of the tile pressing itself onto the Thinset. This is going to allow more time for us to move the tiles around and make adjustments, not only to the grout joint spacings, but also to the height of the tile. We want to make sure that the surface of the tile is going to be as flat as possible, and to do that, we need to reserve that bed of Thinset underneath the tile to allow us to push down in certain spots of the tile. If there's a high corner, for example, we're going to have to push down on that more than we will push down on a corner that's already flush with the surface of the tile next to it. After compressing the tiles into the adhesive and correcting all of the grout joint spacings, the next step is to simply clean up. Remove any Thinset or excess adhesive that has squeezed out the sides of the tile along the side of the sample board. This tile is the Clay Imports Antique Matte Terracotta, and it's already got a sealant on it, the matte sealer, allowing the tile to look as close as possible to natural or an unsealed tile while still having moisture protection. However, if you choose to darken the tile, you can do that by applying a couple of coats of Miracle Sealant Sealant Enhance. 2 to 3 coats of Miracle Sealant Sealant Enhance will typically darken the surface significantly. Before applying any sealant, do one final check just to make sure that there's no dried Thinset adhesive left anywhere on the surface of the tile. And if there is, with a very damp rag, just wipe it away with a little bit of pressure. Now that we're ready for sealer, the first thing is to make sure that you are not pouring your sealer directly onto the surface of the tile. You want to pour it in a container that's large enough to dip your applicator tool, whether that's a sponge or a brush. Make sure the container is big enough that you can dip it into the container and then shake it off a little so you're not dripping sealer onto the tile. You can already see how much the first coat of sealer or just the initial applications of the sealant are darkening the tile. I'm going to keep one piece of the factory antique matte sealed terracotta next to the sample board just so that we can see how much the sample board or the sealed tiles, the Miracle sealed tiles, are darkening. Now it's time to apply the second coat of Miracle Sealant Sealant Enhance. The first coat only took about 30 minutes to dry. Because the tile is saturated or full of sealer from the first coat, this second coat's probably going to take significantly longer to dry. I've also found that if I go too thick on this second coat, that buildup can start to develop into a satin sheen after the tile dries. While we're waiting for the second coat of sealer to dry, I'm going to start preparing the grout. This is Clay Imports' recommended grout, Mapei UltraColor Plus FA. This specific color is called Sandstorm. It's got an earthy feel and it complements dark terracotta tiles very nicely. Because Mapei UltraColor Plus FA is Clay Imports' recommended grout for terracotta tiles, I want to take a moment and point out how unusual this grout mix is. It takes a significant amount of force and time to blend the powder and the water before it starts to look like something that resembles grout. But under no circumstances should you leave any dry pockets or dry grout residue in your grout mixture, as this can lead to permanent grout discoloration. When spreading the grout across the surface of the tile, you need to make sure that you're firmly compressing the grout between the joints. Many terracotta tiles can be significantly thicker than conventional tiles, sometimes up to 1 inch or even 1.5 inches thick. You need to make sure that the grout is fully being compressed and filling all of the space between the tiles. I'll typically let the grout dry on the surface of the tile for between 5 and 10 minutes before I start the initial cleanup, and that dry time allows for the grout between the joints of the tile to harden enough so that when I start cleaning with the damp sponge, it will not remove any grout from the joints. Tile cleanup can be really easy if you start cleaning at the right time. You've got to find that moment when the grout between the joints is hard enough so that when you're washing the surface of the tile, you're not wiping away grout from between the joints. But you also don't want the tile to be on the surface so long that it's gotten so hard that you can't wipe it away with just a damp sponge. Thorough cleaning of the surface of the tile is usually going to take between 2 and 3 wipe downs or washings of the surface of the tile. That's because you need to do this gently. A gentle wash to remove the residue. Let it dry for a little longer. Let the grout between the joints start to get a little bit harder. Let the residue appear again on the surface of the tile, and then wash it again. If the grout is too dry, it's going to be really hard to get it off the surface of the tile. And if the grout's too wet, then you're going to be removing the grout from between the joints as you're washing the surface. It's been 24 hours since I did the second cleaning or washing of the surface of the tile to remove the grout residue. So this is going to be the third cleaning. There's hardly any residue left on the surface, but this final cleaning with just water or perhaps even a little soap and water will ensure that you're getting the surface of the tile completely clean. And for reference, you can see how much the Miracle Seal Sealant Enhance has darkened the tiles on the sample board compared to the original piece, which is the Clay Imports Antique Matte Terracotta. Please ask your installer to make a sample board for you before installing your entire project. They're quick, easy, and cheap.